Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about poorly written code to keep your job. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how do you feel about developers who build production systems using esoteric languages or niche frameworks only they know as a way to gamer political power and job stability? Have you done this yourself or seen others do it? Do you consider it a common and a successful strategy? I work I worked at a company in which one of the senior data engineers, who was highly paid, intentionally built confusing back-end logic and close to zero documentation for the sole purpose of making himself the only person capable of maintaining that portion of the code base. Well, there's a lot of assumptions here that I'm going to question first and foremost, and then I will also give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that, or pretend like you are 100% correct in your assessment of what your senior data engineer did. So, first and foremost, the idea that someone intentionally built confusing backend logic does not make any sense to me. So, unless that person literally sat down with you and had a beer or something and started bragging about how he or she created this horrible system and that nobody understands how it works and that that person did it intentionally, I'm just going to assume that this person simply wrote backend logic that was horrible and confusing. And I'll give you a small personal experience. Data scientists and data engineers, guys, they write shit code. And it's not because they're shit at what they do, it is because they are not software developers. A data engineer, depending on what you're dealing with, is a person who is in essence maintaining a portfolio of Python scripts that pulls data from different sources and like formats it into a certain format and things like that. You have to understand, guys, that just because you do some type of work, like as an example, data engineering, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to write good software. This is of course true for the software developers as well. I'm just putting it out there. Don't assume like that someone did it intentionally just because the code is bad. Other thing that we're touching on here is that there was zero documentation. Well, that's kind of common. I work with a coworker today who is an extraordinarily good software developer, but he simply does not believe in documentation. Now, he and me, we've had some coaching sessions, and he's understood that his way of working no longer flies because he simply cannot even himself remember all of the decisions that have been made over the years in the code base where you will ask him, and it's actually very easy for that person to start to realize that there is a need for some type of documentation when you can ask them about features. Oh, how is this supposed to work? What was the decision here? Why does this number have significance? And he doesn't remember. It's not like he's a bad person. It's not that he's a bad developer. He's an extraordinarily good developer. It's simply that he did not feel the need to document anything. And your person could be, or your senior data engineer could be the same sort of individual, right? Now, there is absolutely a certain validity to this idea that yes, you can pick an obscure language or a framework, or you can like roll your own thing. That's always a good one when you invent your own framework or something like that, and you do it in a way where it might make sense to you but it doesn't make sense to anybody else. Now the hard part about this is to prove that this is for the purpose of obscuring code. This is the tricky part, because this can be completely unintentional, and the norm is that it is unintentional. It is usually unintentional that someone picks a stack or a solution or rolls their own framework or tool with the intention of making it stabilizing their own position within the company so that they are the only ones who can maintain it. It's the reason why this is very uncommon is because if you were to do that deliberately, it's not going to be an effective strategy most of the time. Sometimes it can absolutely work, but most of the time it's not going to be an effective strategy. On average, most developers don't do this. Most developers do actually pick things. If this situation happens, it's usually because they were inspired by some new framework or some new tool, or they're philosophers and they were convinced that this was a good idea, but it turns out later that, hey, it's actually not a good idea. This is I like to call this the cost that every IT company pays for either for hiring mid-levels or junior developers or without senior supervision, and I mean not just supervision, we're going to touch on that as well, or that they have this, if that they don't follow the expert democracy, or they just have an absolute democracy where the juniors and the philosophers, they can do whatever the hell they want. The reason why this happens, in my opinion, is because you allow either you have senior developers who don't really care about the quality of the code base. They're just doing their thing and they don't care about what the juniors and the mid-levels are doing. And the juniors and the mid-levels, they simply are not capable of understanding, because they don't have the experience, what a good solution looks like or what a bad solution looks like. So they are in front, and this is, I think, the most telling thing there is in the world. You can measure how much how in control you are of your code base by the amount of dependencies that your developers add to the code base, because there is no area within web development as full of legacy, in my opinion at the very least, as the front-end code base. And it is directly tied into the fact that people are adding dependencies left and right and creating their own super solutions and trying to have their specific workflow and so forth. But you're never standardizing on anything. You're just adding ad hoc things based on whatever whims you have at the moment. Now, this is something that actually leads to this problem, but it does so involuntarily. It's not intentional for this to happen, but it does happen, and it never fails. Every single job I've ever had as a front-end developer, excluding maybe one or two, has left me being the cleanup crew, has left me in a position where they hire me to basically take care of the mess that they created. And they did not create that mess to keep their job. It's very obvious that they didn't do that because they already lost the person who did the job before me, or like that person quit. So now it's my turn to take up the mantle. And so it's not a very effective means of doing this if you do it intentionally. And it is not effective for one specific reason. Guys, code is not magic. There's no magic involved at all. I'm very sorry to say it. The fact of the matter is that even the worst code that you can possibly imagine can be it is comprehensible. It might be very hard to understand it, but it is possible to understand it. So it's just a matter of taking the time to fixing it. If you hire a developer and give them a code base that is extremely obscure, yeah, sure, they might need more time to understand what's going on, and there might be more bugs and regressions and so forth, but it is possible. I mean, shit, I used to work on a application at one point. I'm very glad to say that I only had to do a few stories on it, where it was a Flash application, a monstrously big Flash application. It's probably one of the biggest applications in the world. And we didn't have the source code to that thing. We had to decompile it, and I had to sit with the decompiled source, where basically every variable was a T or a Y or an A or a B, and when like the variable, like the method names didn't make any sense whatsoever. And that was that's what was needed at that time to solve the problem. But we still made it through. It took a long time, and it was really error prone, and we had to do a lot of testing, but we managed. So, what I want you to take away from this is that it does happen that someone might use an obscure language or a specific framework or roll their own thing and so forth. It's not that common that people do it just to keep a job. And one other kind of interesting thought there is, how would you prove that that is the case unless you literally, I don't know, record them saying so to you that they did that? Most of the time this is it's a benign thing. People do it either because they don't have the experience or because they don't care. That's usually how these sorts of issues come to light. Where you have someone who is not really capable of making a good solution, or is very naive, or like just experimental and doesn't think about the big picture, and they create this sort of solution. And even as in this case, a senior data engineer, guys, just because you're a senior something, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to write good code. And I've said this on more than a few occasions. Depending on the type of person you're dealing with, they might be like basically just shoveling out legacy code on a daily basis. And this is the thing that all the companies are afraid of. This is the thing that the code interviews are about, the personal interviews, and like all this stuff is here in place so that this does not happen. It still may happen, but it is not as common as you might think. And as I said, the reason why is because it's actually not an effective way for you to keep your job. Sometimes it's going to work, but most of the time, if the issue really is there, it's simply a matter of hiring developers and giving them enough time to figure out what the issue is. We can talk about which one you prefer to deal with, because either you keep the person who created the mess or you hire more people. But as I said, it's usually the case that you hire more people and just give them more time to figure out the problem with the system, because unfortunately, if you only stick with that one developer who knew the entire system, well, then you can't scale the solution. Then you're pretty much done for. The company will never grow bigger than that one individual, and if that individual quits, well, then you have to dismantle the entire company. And most companies don't do that. They simply invest more money into fixing the legacy that person created. Have a great day.